Today what we're gonna do is we will see how to set up the MicroStrategy environment. Okay. So now if you look over here, this is the MicroStrategy architecture, right? I think we have already discussed that. So whenever you work on any warehouse project, you will come across all these components. From a MicroStrategy perspective, we have two things. We have one data warehouse from where we need to fetch the data, and second is the MicroStrategy metadata. When we say the MicroStrategy metadata, it's a repository which stores all the object definitions, the configuration details, the connectivity details. Okay, so all the information about your objects within the MicroStrategy, including your configuration and connectivity details, have been stored in metadata. So when I say that if I create any connection to the warehouse, that information is stored. Which credential has to be used, that information has been stored. If I try to create any new object, that information has been stored. So when I say that this all information has been stored, that means my metadata needs to consist of some tables and columns, which will allow to store all such information. And that's the first thing whenever we set up the MicroStrategy after the installation. If I look from the configuration perspective, the first thing that we need to do is we need to set up the metadata. We need to configure the metadata, which will allow to store all this information. And how we can do? That's the first thing that we're going to see today. Throughout our training, we're going to use the Microsoft Access as a database. For some reason, we believe for some training components, we're also going to use the SQL Server, like when we use the Enterprise Manager or when we use the narrowcasting. At that point of time, I'm going to use the SQL Server. But today, the metadata configuration that we're going to do over here, it's going to be based on the Microsoft Access. I have a database. You could have any schema. It should be a blank schema for the first time configuration. A metadata is a one-time configuration. You're not going to do the metadata configuration every time. It's just a one-time configuration. If I come back to the MicroStrategy, okay, if I just come back to the MicroStrategy tool over here, you see there are different project sources. You can see the MicroStrategy Analytics module, MicroStrategy Analytics modules direct. These are all project source. When I say a project source in MicroStrategy, it is a connection directly or indirectly with the metadata. We will see how to directly or indirectly connect it. But the first thing that we're going to see is how to configure the metadata. But just remember one more thing over here, that my project source needs to point to metadata directly or indirectly. In order to configure the metadata, one thing that you need is the blank schema or a blank database. On top of that, you need to create a ODBC connection. I'll just open a notepad over here. The first thing that I need is a blank database. Along with that, I need to create a ODBC. Whenever the MicroStrategy has to interact with the database for any reason, either it's a metadata or the actual warehouse, it has to be via ODBC. When I say ODBC, it's an open database source connection. ODBC is a Windows component which needs to have all the details about your database, your server, what type of database you're using, and if in case you want to give any other connectivity details. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I will go to one location, okay, under my databases, okay. Under this database, okay, one second, let me just, avoid the confusion over here. I don't want to get all these things. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create one Access file, and that will be completely blank file. When I say it's going to be a completely blank file, that's going to be the blank Access database under which we will configure the metadata. So I'm going to say over here, let me just open the Access database. I'm going to say Microsoft Office Access. I'm going to create a blank database. I will select the location where I want to create this particular file. Over here, I'm going to select as 2002-2003 format, and I'm going to say as metadata, this time for the admin. Okay, So we are just giving a name over here as metadata admin. I will say OK and I will say create. So we have just created a blank access file. No tables, no columns, nothing. Just a simple blank database. So if you look over here, my access file has been created successfully. It's completely blank. So this step has been created where we have the blank database. If in case you are using an Oracle or Teradata or any other database, you just need a schema which does not have any tables, no other information, just a complete blank schema. In order to have your MicroStrategy to connect or to talk with your database, you need a ODBC. A ODBC is an open database source connection. It's a Windows component where you're going to provide your linking to the database or the information about your database. So I'll go to the control panel. Under the control panel, you will go to the administrative tools. Under the administrative tools, you will have the ODBC data sources. So click on the ODBC data sources. Under that, you have the system DSN. And over here, you're going to create a new ODBC, which is pointing to the required database. We need this particular ODBC to point to a Microsoft Access database that we have just created. So I'm going to click on add over here. Thereafter, I have to select the driver. Driver means that is the database type. Based on the database type that you are using, you have to select the corresponding driver so that you can give the details about your database. Now let's say I'm using a SQL Server. So what I will do is I will just come down. I already have a SQL Server driver. I will select that particular driver. I'll give the server information which server I want to connect to. That's it. If I'm using an Oracle, let's say, I'll go to the Oracle driver. I'll give the Oracle server name, host name, and so on. And so that all the database details I'm going to give to it. I'm using Microsoft Access. We are using Microsoft Access. So we're going to select the Microsoft Access driver. I'm going to say finish. And after that, you need to give the name to your ODBC, and you need to select the Access database that we have just created. So over here, I'm going to give the same name. That's metadata underscore admin. You can give any name. Okay. And I'm going to select that particular Access database file. So I'll go to that location. Okay. And under this, we already have the metadata underscore admin. I'm going to say, so you can clearly see that particular Access file has been selected. And I will say OK. If I check, cross check over here, this Access file has been mapped under the new ODBC. So we have first created the blank database, and second, we have created a new ODBC which is pointing to a database. I will take a pause over here. Any questions so far?
Hi, Dennis.
Yes, please.
If you using SQL Server or SQL database, then how you are going to create, the access?
How are we going to create the ODBC? That's what you said?
Yeah. Yes.
That's what I said, right? You just have to click on add. You select the corresponding driver over here. So now let's say okay. So if I'm using a SQL.
Yes. I understand that when we select that driver, corresponding driver, but before that we have to make one file. No, we need to create one Access database.
No. Access database is not compulsory every time. That's what I said. That depends upon the database that you're using. I'm using Microsoft Access, and that's the reason. Yeah, that's the reason I have selected the Microsoft Access driver. If in case you're using a SQL Server, that means you need, so that means you need a blank database under the SQL Server. In that case, you do not have to create the Access file then. Okay. So under your SQL Server, you need to have the database which is completely blank, no tables, no columns, nothing. And that information, that SQL Server information, I will map under the ODBC.
Yes.
Make sense?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So now if you look over here, a new ODBC has been created successful. Now under this ODBC, under this particular database, I want to configure my metadata. So the next step over here, after this has all been done, we need to make sure that we configure our required metadata. And in order to do this, we have a component called as configuration wizard. The configuration wizard, it's a MicroStrategy component, okay? The configuration wizard is a MicroStrategy component which will allow you to configure the metadata. So now what I'm going to do is, I will go to the configuration wizard. This is the MicroStrategy configuration wizard, okay? So we'll go to the configuration wizard. Okay. And if you look over here, this is the MicroStrategy configuration wizard window. And I can see there are a few things that I can do over here. The first thing is to create the metadata. Along with the metadata, you can even create the history list and statistics repository tables. But that is something that we will see when we try to work on the enterprise manager or the other the history list messages and so on. But for today, we are just interested to creating on metadata. We do not want to create any history list tables. We do not want to create any statistics. These are all important, but when we cover the other topics. But for now, when we are setting up the MicroStrategy environment, the main component that you need is the metadata. So I will say, yes, I want to create the metadata. I'll click on next. I will deselect the other options. I don't want to create as of today. I will just create the metadata. I will say next. And you have to select the correct ODBC under which you want to create your metadata. So if you look over here, this is the DSN list. And if I click on the drop down, it will show you all the ODBCs that have been created under your machine. And that's the reason before coming to MicroStrategy, we created the required ODBC. So we created the access file, we created the ODBC on top of that, because MicroStrategy will only interact with the ODBC in order to connect to the database. So if you look over here, these are all ODBCs. Okay, I just have a question over here. This is a question from Abhishek Chaudhary, which says, for strong MicroStrategy metadata, is there any restriction on choices of database? Say instead of SQL Server Access or Teradata, I wish to use Vertica for strong metadata. Is it possible? So Abhishek, if to answer your question over here, MicroStrategy has a predefined list of the tables under which you can create your metadata. Okay. Now, there is no restriction as such with respect to your database, because metadata is just important to get all the definition, and based on that, it's going to generate the SQL. Depending upon the versions that you use, there is a MicroStrategy 9, MicroStrategy 10. So if in case, when I say that you want to use some different database, MicroStrategy should have a compatible SQL which can be executed on that database to create your metadata. Okay, so first, whenever you're working on any of the version, you first need to check whether it is really possible to select the Vertica or any other database under which I can configure my metadata. From the performance perspective, metadata is not going to play any role. Your performance is going to be based on your data warehousing that you do. MicroStrategy metadata is just to fetch the object definition, and based on that, it's going to formulate the SQL query. That's it. So metadata could be anything. I can even use the Microsoft Access for my high-end data, for high-end warehouse support. So just to answer your question, there is nothing as with respect to the strong metadata. You can use it anything. But yes, MicroStrategy should have the compatible SQL which can be executed in your database to configure the metadata.
In the list of drivers which we just saw, there were like just limited list of drivers were available. So in case any new database comes,
then you have to add your drivers manually. Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
all right.
yes.
And
Yes, under my machine, I have not installed all my databases. I don't want to make my laptop heavy, so I've just installed SQL Server. If I install the Oracle as well on my machine, I need to make sure that I add the Oracle driver so that I can create a ODBC on top of it. Okay, so you have yes, perfect. All right, so coming back over here. So we need to select the DSN, that is the correct database under which you need to configure your metadata. So we have already created the ODBC, and that's the name metadata_admin. As soon as I click over here, I'm using Microsoft Access, which does not require any credentials. If in case you are using any other database which requires the credentials that has to be used by MicroStrategy to log in, you have to specify over here. I'm not using it. I don't have to give it because I'm using Microsoft Access. I will say next. Once I click on next, this window says you directly have to click on finish, and this will make sure that my MicroStrategy metadata is configured. Before I click on finish, I wanted to show you what exactly MicroStrategy does. Once I click on finish, MicroStrategy will run a script at the back end, which will make sure that it configures the metadata correctly. That means it's going to create the required tables and the columns which are important from the metadata perspective. If you look at the last line under the summary window, which says it's a script file. This is the script file which has been fetched from my installation folder, and it's going to pick up the correct required file that has to get executed. Let me go to that location. Okay, I'll go to that location for you. This is the folder where I have installed my MicroStrategy, of course, and I will go to that SQL files. Okay, these are all SQL files, and the one SQL files that starts from MD. MD stands for metadata. So if I look over here, the one which I have selected, okay, these are all SQL files. Depending upon the database that you use, automatically it's going to get picked up, it's going to get executed, and my metadata configuration happens successfully. I'm using Access, right? So it's going to pick up MD ACC. MD stands for metadata, ACC is for the Access database. So MicroStrategy is going to automatically pick it up the script file, and it says, okay, this is the this is the SQL file that has to get executed. I'll show you when that Access file, that particular SQL file, you can see it has all the create table and the insert statements over here. At no point of time you're going to modify this. Just remember one thing, you're not going to modify these particular SQL files over here. This is the metadata file, which will make sure that whatever the 14 or the 20 tables that it has to create it, it's going to get created successfully after this script file has been executed. If in case you're using, let's say, SQL Server, right? So it will automatically come over here. It's going to pick up this particular SQL file, that is MD SQL, metadata for the SQL Server. That particular script file will be executed, which is compatible with the SQL Server, and all my required tables and the columns would be created successfully. So these are all SQL files that it's going to get picked up based on the type of database that you're using. This particular SQL file is going to get executed at the backend, and once the script file has been executed, you can clearly say my metadata is configured successfully. So if I come back to the configuration wizard, I can see that the script file that has been picked up is MD_ACC. That is this one. Why MD_ACC? Because we are using Microsoft Access as a database. So once I click on finish, you can just visualize that this particular script file is getting executed. And once the script file has been executed successfully, my metadata is configured. So we'll just wait for a few seconds, I would say, that will make sure that it's created successfully. So it says completed. And now if I come back to a location where I have saved my database, we are using metadata admin, right? So now this time when I open this, you can see on the left hand side, this all tables have been created, which starts with the name DSS. Okay, DSS means these are all tables which are related to my metadata. So if you look over here, that script file got executed successfully, and now we started with a blank file, right? But now you can see all the tables have been available over here, which will be important, which will be needed once you start working on MicroStrategy. So this is the first step that you need to make sure whenever you're working, like, you know, you're just setting up your environment. That is the first thing you need to do is you need to configure the metadata. I will take a pause over here. Any question with respect to the metadata configuration so far?
What are the most important tables in this list of metadata, which we
all
should
tables? We don't have to cross-check. All tables are important. If you ask me, no, see.
The question was around, say, sometimes suppose a report definition gets corrupt. Now, if you want to correct that, is it possible to update metadata, or which table we should look for?
Metadata is not related to the report. Metadata is related to your entire project source. My entire project source can have multiple projects, and under that multiple projects, you will have multiple reports. Okay. So if your report gets corrupted, if it's only your single report gets corrupted, yes, there is a third-party tool which you can run on the metadata. But that, see, there are two things that, you know, works out. Either your development is incorrect because of what it got corrupted, or there is some inconsistent metadata. So now when I say it's an inconsistency in metadata, there is a third-party tool called ScanMD or MD Doctor, which you have to run on metadata, and that will, if possible, that will resolve your inconsistency. But even if that doesn't work, then I would not suggest you to do any updates on your metadata, because if you try to do any changes over here, because these are all encrypted, even if you create any new user and if you try to see any user information over here, these are all encrypted. So you cannot make changes directly to the metadata. You have to either recreate your report, or you just have to see what is the workaround.
So information in all the tables is encrypted, or specific tables are encrypted?
Specific tables are encrypted. Not all the tables are encrypted, I would say. The specific tables are encrypted. But yes, let's say if I go to this table, this is the user account. Okay. So if you look over here, there are certain user, let's say the administrator, which has all the informations over here. So these are all encrypted information. So if you can see, this is an object ID, this is the project ID. So this have been used for the joining conditions with the other tables to get the user related information. So now let's say I have, 1 second, I'll just show you one. Okay, these are all tables which have been used. I do not have anyone with the password actually, so I just wanted to I do not have anyone with the normal password, but yes, if in case you have assigned any password to the user, it's going to be entirely encrypted over here. And just to add over here, you cannot modify the password by doing the updates in the metadata. It's completely encrypted. So whatever the encrypted information, you don't want the user to see it, or the admin to see it, those are encrypted. But rest, let's say it's a blank, so I cannot show you all the tables. But let me just go. Let's see if I have anything under the object definition. This is one. Yeah, because I've still not created any project in any object, and that's the reason it is not showing me any information. But if I go to any of one of the metadata, which was already been created, and if I go to the object definitions, not object dependency. Okay, so now let's say you're trying to find a dependency. So these are all based on the IDs. So you will not be able to understand which object IDs they are referring to. So these are all related, interrelated over here. This will get joined with some other tables to get the object information. So it will come over here. It will say, okay, which object ID has been used. and that corresponds to which either it's an attribute or it's a language or what. So based on the object type, you can clearly see either it's going to be my table, it's going to be my attribute, it's going to be my project. So all this object related informations over here. So this are not encrypted, but yes, it's going to make the joinings on the object IDs. These object IDs, you can find it out from the MicroStrategy tool as well. But yes, this is how the MicroStrategy maintains all the information. So all the informations are not encrypted. Definitely, you can get the certain informations about your objects and all the linking parts from the metadata tables.
Got it.
Okay, all right. All right. So if you look over here, we have confirmed that my metadata has been configured successfully. Now, once my metadata has been configured successfully, the next thing that you need to do is you need to configure your project source. As I said in the start that my project source has to be connected to the metadata directly or indirectly. When I say directly, it's called as two-tier connection. I have metadata on my machine and I'm just pointing my project source to that particular metadata. So everything is happening local to my machine, which means that no other person can access this environment. Even though they are under the same network, they cannot access my environment because everything is local. The second way, the other way which you can configure your project source is in server, where you will have one centralized MicroStrategy server, which is pointing to the required metadata, and you will have project source, which is pointing to the server, which means that if you ask me in the real-time scenario in your company, there would be one machine under which your server would be configured. When I say the server has been configured, it means my MicroStrategy server is pointing to the metadata. And once that configuration has been done, once that server configuration has been done, the rest all other folks who are working on the environment can directly create a project source. They can directly give a connection to the server so that all the people, all the developers or the architects or the user can access the environment. So the next thing is that before we even create the project source in a direct or a server mode, the next thing that we're going to do is let's try to configure the server. When we say the configuring the server, it means that we are configuring the MicroStrategy intelligence server to point to the metadata. Okay, so that also happens under the configuration wizard, and you can see over here the next thing that you can do is configure intelligent server. You need to configure the intelligent server when you want a server environment, or else it's just going to be everything local. So I will say no, I need a server environment, and in that case I will say configure intelligent server. The configuration of intelligent server means it has to point to the required metadata. If you don't configure the metadata, you cannot configure the intelligent server. My server, before even configuring the server, my metadata has to be configured. So I would say yes, I want to configure the server, and under that again I have to select the DSN, which is pointing to my metadata. So I will select the same ODBC over here, under which we have already configured the metadata. I will say next. Once I say next, it needs a credential. It needs an administrator credential to access the metadata. This is the first time configuration, and that's the reason by default my login ID would be administrator with a blank password. You can clearly see a note over here. If this is the first time you're connecting to the intelligence server, use the username as administrator without a password. And once all this configuration has been done, at any point of time, you can change the administrator password as per your requirement, and same has to be used thereafter. But this is the first time, so by default, it is an administrator with a blank password. So I will say next. It's trying to log in into the metadata. Just wait over here. Okay. Thereafter, you have to give the name to the server. Just by know by which name the server has to get identified. You can give your name, company name, machine name, whatever the name you want to assign it to. I will go ahead with my laptop name. So I will say next. This is the name that I want to assign it to my up. And I will say finish. Once I click on finish, it means that it has started doing the server configuration. And the server configuration, it means my server will start pointing to the required metadata. So we'll just wait for a minute or two. And once this has been done, we can say that my MicroStrategy intelligence server has been configured successfully. Okay, so let's just wait. It is restarting my server. Okay, and now I can see my MicroStrategy intelligence server has been configured successfully. Once this has been done, I can simply say close. We'll come back over here. So now my metadata is configured successfully, and even my server is configured successfully. The third and the last step that you need to make sure over here is that you need to create your project source. As I said, the project source can be configured in two modes, direct mode or a server mode, 2-tier or a 3-tier. Let's try to create a project source which is directly pointing to the metadata that is in 2-tier connection or a direct connection. I'll right click over here and I would say create new project source. I will say create new project source. I'll just give some name, let's say 2-tier. Okay, and another connection mode I will select as direct. When I say a direct connection mode, that means I just have to select the metadata. So my metadata is metadata underscore admin, and I will say okay, that's it. So over here you can clearly see my project source has been configured in a direct mode or a 2-tier mode. We will even try to create a project source in a 3-tier or a server mode. Same thing, right click, say new project source. Under this, I will give some name, let's say as 3-tier. Okay. And under the connection mode, I'm going to give this as server. When I say that I want to create a project source in a server mode, you need to give the exact server name which you have given while doing the configuration. So let me see which are all active servers. This was the name that we gave while doing the configuration of server, right? So I'm going to select this server name over here and I will say okay. So the difference is that when I say 2-tier, it is directly pointing to the metadata. That's it. No other person, no other machine can access my environment. But when I'm trying to do a configuration via server mode, it means that I already have one server which has been deployed. And if you're under the same network, I can create one project source, and under that I will give the server name, and that is the server which is pointing to my metadata. So if you look over here, both the project sources have been configured successfully, and if I try to log in into any one of the project, my login would be successful, but it will say no projects written, because as of now it's a completely blank. No projects have been defined or created under this project source. Even if I try to log in into the server mode, once my authentication is successful, it will say no projects written by this project source, because as of now we have still not created any project. What is a project? A project is that has to be created under the project source, which is pointing to your actual warehouse, actual data on which you want to do your reporting. Okay, so as of now we have just configured the project sources. The next thing, of course, we have to create the project, and we have to point a project to your actual warehouse, but that we will see in the next call. But for today, I'm just going to recap what are the things that we have discussed. First, we have configured the metadata. We created the Access database, that is the blank database. Via configuration wizard, we configured the metadata. We saw that there is a script file which gets executed at the backend to configure the metadata successfully. Once the metadata was configured, we configured the intelligent server. And after that, we came back to the MicroStrategy developer tool, and under that, we configured our project source in both the modes, direct mode as well as the server mode. Are we good till here? Any question? No? All right. So we'll just stop over here for today. I mean that this is all that we have for today. In the next call, we're going to discuss how to create the project, how to map your project to the actual warehouse, and from there, how the architects and developer can start working. Okay.